Okay, so I'll get started whilst the last few just join us. So hello and welcome to today's FSHR and Compliance Network webinar, setting the D&I agenda in financial services for 2022. I'm Zoe Foster, I chair the network, and I'm also head of marketing and events for at our co-sponsor, Veran Performance. I hope you're all keeping well and feeling positive about the potential government rule changes that might take place as early as next week, apparently. So fingers crossed. I'm blown away today by the number of registrations we had for this event. So it's obviously a topic that resonates with a lot of our community. Last year, we actually increased our membership by more than 10% and plan to exceed that this year. So do invite your team to come along to our regular sessions and join in these conversations, and hopefully we'll be back in person in March. Now, usually I give a bit of background about the network for those that haven't been to our events before. I say how valuable the network is for HR and compliance professionals, how it's a space to collaborate and share best practice under Chatham House rules. But really, all you need to know is that it's the best network for like-minded HR and compliance professionals. And if you're going to be part of any network, it's this one, because we genuinely have the best members who are passionate about the role they're in financial services. And they genuinely want to promote a consistent approach to regulatory and non-regulatory challenges in the industry. We are a not-for-profit organisation, and we are kindly sponsored by two amazing companies who are both on our panel today. The first is Veran Performance, the leading HR and finance technology and transformation consultancy for financial services and other industries too. And Osborne Clarke, lawyers who strive to help tackle the challenges you're facing today and prepare you for the ones that you'll face tomorrow. And we have Tom Holmes from Veran, Olivia and Vic and James, all from Osborne Clarke, here with us on our panel today. So if you have any questions about the network or our sponsors, please contact me after the webinar, and also join our LinkedIn group, which I'll share the link after the session via an email. So moving on to the agenda for this morning, I'll shortly be handing over to James Turner, Associate Director at Osborne Clarke, who will be setting the regulatory scene for us for Q1 of this year. So lots of exciting things going on. James will then hand straight over to Tom Holmes, Founding Director of Veran Performance, who will be chairing the panel session today, focusing on diversity and inclusion and diving into some of the subtopics, including neurodiversity, age, social mobility, and ethnic diversity. Tom is joined by our brilliant panelists, as I say, Olivia, Tali Shlomo, and Victoria Parry, who will probably be introduced at the time, and they'll go through that properly then. And Tom's nodding, so that's good. So live Q&A is available throughout the webinar, so please use the Q&A button, which can be found across the panel along the bottom. We will aim to answer as many as we can, but do send them in, and if we can't, we'll answer them afterwards. And if you do miss anything, don't worry, we'll be sending around the on-demand recording when it's available. The session should take us to about 10 o'clock. So with time in mind, I'm going to hand straight over to James. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. As always, your timekeeping is impeccable, and so I will endeavour to do exactly the same. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. And as always, with financial services, there is far too much for me to cover in any detail in 10 minutes. So I'm going to pick out a couple of the really hot topics. So just to begin with, actually, earlier this week, one of my favourite topics is the emerging and evolving area of crypto asset regulation, and we actually have a lot of questions for clients, because it's the regulation of crypto assets is actually much more complicated than the media sometimes makes it sound. However, it is the case that as things stand at the moment, regulation of your classic cryptocurrencies such as trading in Bitcoin, buying Ether, etc. The advertising of those activities is unregulated by the FCA. The ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, has taken various actions against what it deems misleading ads under its relatively limited powers. But as of 2 days ago, the government have confirmed their intention to bring advertising of crypto assets into the regulatory perimeter. Now, quite how much difference this will actually make in practice, I think, is a bit of an open question. But the key thing to take away, if you or your business are either in the business of advertising crypto assets or thinking to get into it in some form, as many people I have conversations with are, the regulatory environment is going to be quite different. Probably not immediately, excuse me, but probably by about the summer. So that's item one. And then the more of a main course, if you like, for this, and this is one of my favorite topics, which I've spoken about in this forum before. Immediately before Christmas, we had the FCA's publication on the next phase in its new consumer duty proposals. So this is potentially a massive mindset shift in the way in which firms need to approach customer outcomes and the way in which they design products and indeed operate products through the entire life cycle. Opinion is slightly divided among myself and my peers as to how much of a change it will actually be. You will certainly find no shortage of people that say, especially in the context of investments, this probably adds very little to the regime that we currently have. However, the FCA are on record in a number of different places as saying they expect this to make a material difference to the way in which firms operate. The way in which this has now taken shape, effectively, is we will have a new principle, a principle 12, which is that firms must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. That's the first trap, because retail customers doesn't just mean consumers. Retail customers will include small and medium-sized enterprise clients where they are currently within FCA regulation. So if you're an insurer, for example, doing small business insurance, and effectively the way the perimeter is now proposed to work is that where your small business policies are currently regulated, they will be subject to this new duty. So if you're outside ICOBs, this won't necessarily change that part of your business, but if you're in, it will be incremental. Sitting underneath that new principle are 3 cross-cutting rules which are designed to expand the principle. Act in good faith, avoid foreseeable harm to retail customers, and then thirdly, enable and support retail customers to pursue their financial objectives. And as people who've heard me speak before, that's probably the area where I feel the most exposed, partially because very cynically, I'm one of those people that think that the majority, particularly of consumers, wouldn't actually be able to tell you what their own financial objectives are, to be honest. But now it seems that actually firms are going to have a positive duty to factor those objectives into their plans and actually operate so as to deliver them. Sitting underneath that still is 4 outcomes, and this is probably where the meat of it comes and where most of the doing rather than the thinking and the talking will need to take place. The 4 outcomes have now been named as products and services, which is essentially product design. Secondly, price and value, and I will talk a bit about that because I think that is a real challenge for the industry in terms of what the FCA has drafted. Thirdly, customer understanding, which is essentially how do you communicate with customers and explain things to them. And then lastly, what the FCA are now terming consumer support, but you can think of that broadly speaking as customer services. What does the customer actually experience day to day when they're using the product or engaging with you? As I said, I wanted to talk a tiny bit about price and value while I've still got a few minutes left, because that I suspect is the area where there's going to have to be the most work. So looking at this in terms of what you need to do, Originally, the plan was for these rules and guidance to come into force in the middle of this year, July this year. That has now been pushed back due to industry resistance as to effectively just how much work there will need to be to ensure that everyone is ready for this. And the reason for that, in terms of, if you just hear what I've said over the past couple of minutes for the first time, you may think, well, that doesn't sound too horrendous. The difficulty is, if you're a large institution, the FCA are explicit in their 71 pages of guidance that they expect you to have assessed every single product and every single customer journey in order to determine what possible outcomes customers may actually experience from that product and that outcome. I have spent much of my career in-house, and I've worked in both a very large financial institution and in a very small startup. And from a resource perspective, I know which of those organizations is better placed to cope with it in terms of having an army of people. So the date we're now working to is actually the middle of 2023, albeit the FCA are also explicit that what they don't want to see is people effectively pushing this into next year and not thinking about it. It's very obvious their expectation is that firms, now that we've got rules and guidance to work to, ought to be looking at this and thinking it through how this impacts them. So as I think I've got 2 or 3 minutes left, so I will just alight on the price and value outcome a tiny bit. And the reason I think this is so important is, as we know historically, the FCA is not an economic regulator in the way of an Ofgem or an Office of Rail Regulation, for example. And this is still not quite economic regulation in the sense of the FCA saying positively, this is what you're allowed to charge. And what the rules do in brief is give a list of factors that you are required and an additional list of factors that you may take into account when assessing whether the pricing of your product delivers fair value to a customer. Fair value effectively being the benefits the customer gets reasonably relate to the price that you're charging the customer. And then the rules sort of stop. So you can go off and do your analysis, although the bit that I'm, in all seriousness, and if people have got ideas about this, then I would really love to hear them, because we're already starting to get quite a few queries about this, is you can do your analysis, but there's still nothing concrete in the rules that tells you how much is too much. If we had another hour, I could speculate or think about a number of ways in which we might approach that problem. But I guess I'll just leave you now with the message that this is a very substantial piece of work that will require careful judgment and a lot of preparation. So please don't leave it for, say, a year from now when I'm sure I'll be reminding you of it. Today's topic, as you know, is diversity and inclusion in financial services, which also happens to be one of my favourite topics. So I will call it there and hand over to Tom.
Thanks, James. That was brilliant. Morning, everybody. My name's Tom Holmes, and I am founding director of Veran Performance, digital transformation consultancy focusing on FS and HR matters, i.e. implementing new technology and stuff like that for financial services firms. And I'm delighted that this morning we're doing an important panel session this morning focusing on diversity and inclusion. And I'm delighted to be joined by, firstly, Olivia Sinfield, who is partner with Osborne Clarke. Morning, Olivia.
Sorry, Tom, you took me slightly by surprise with the good morning. Morning, it's really good to be back for 2022.
Great. Yeah, I'm trying to go at a fair clip, Olivia, to keep everybody awake and keep us going on this D&I piece. So next, we have Vic Parry, who is the practice group head and chair of Diversity Champions Forum, also at Osborne Clarke. So morning, Vic.
Good morning. Happy Thursday, everyone.
And finally, Tali Shlomo, who is inclusion and diversity consultant with Swiss Re Management, and internationally recognized D&I and Wellbeing thought leader. So Tali, welcome. You've been a member for many years, and I'm delighted that you're back. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Really excited to be here this morning.
So I'm going to move straight on to our agenda, and we've got quite a few questions to discuss. Hopefully they're going to hit the questions you've got about D&I and what we should be doing. If not, or if there are additional questions, please post them and I'll field them to the team. So kicking straight off with Vix. Vix, can you explain where OC is coming from and where it's headed on the D&I front?
Thanks, Tom. So OC's been on quite a journey in the D&I space, and let me say straight away that we're still on that journey and it's not perfect. So, you know, we are thinking and going as we go. Our journey started really in the noughties when a group of us, we had a passion and a purpose, but frankly not a lot else at that point, and we formed a gender network because we felt people really needed a voice. And we rumbled along, but it was really just a forum where people got to know each other and had an opportunity to voice opinions. So we didn't really have much power and influence. Roll forward 2014, we got a new managing partner, and he put D&I right to the top of the agenda because he sort of recognised that it wasn't just a nice to have, but as the FCA is saying, it's a business imperative. So lots and lots of steps, and we can talk to you about those, but essentially we built a D&I strategy. And when we did that, we essentially decided that we were going to have 3 non-negotiables. The first was that we wanted OC to be a place where everybody could feel free to be themselves. We knew we got smart people, but we felt that if they were psychologically safe, we'd get more out of them. We were more likely to get better discretionary effort, and they would feel liberated to make brave calls in their work, and it would give us a better performance. So we decided early doors that inclusion was as important, if not more important, than diversity. The second non-negotiable for us is we decided that it had to come from the top. So this has to be driven by exec board, and I'm a member of exec board, and I have to say that every decision we make is reflected through a D&I lens. So we'll make decisions and then we'll cross-check ourselves to see if it's pushing us further forward on the D&I journey. We decided it couldn't be buried in a drawer somewhere in a back office. And the third non-negotiable that we decided we would do is that we would call out bad behaviour, even if it came from one of our biggest billers, because we decided that as a firm, we had to walk the talk on that, and our people were watching us. And if we didn't call out bad behaviour, we'd have no credibility in the space. So people did and do continue to get measured on D&I, and it actually feeds into our remuneration process. So I'll stop talking there, Tom. Just let me.
Great, Vic. So you set out those 3 principles way back when, but you mentioned steps as well. So what steps are you taking now, building on that foundation?
So we're taking lots and lots of steps, as you can imagine, and this centres around recruitment, retention, and progression. To put a structure around it, what we did is we called out 6 areas for focus at OC. So that's gender, age, race, pride, mind and body, and social mobility. And all of those areas, all of those focus groups have have a network, and they all have a chair, and there's lots of focused activity in each of the different networks, because as you can imagine, everybody's got bespoke needs. So you know, we might have we do have reverse mentoring in the race group, whereas in the social mobility group we've partnered with the bridge group, and we look at a lot of recruitment and how our recruitment processes could be better. So for example, we've taken up apprenticeships, and we're looking at putting people's achievements in context so that law doesn't just remain an elite profession for the middle classes. So there's lots and lots of good stuff going on there. We've hired a head of corporate responsibility, and Bola has put a rigor and a roadmap around what I would call our strategy. But all of that is good for nothing unless it's joined up and it moves us forward each month. So every month, the chairs from each of the groups come together with me, and we look at the themes and the challenges and the issues, so that these are then fed back up to exec board on a monthly basis, and then we build that back into our strategy, so that in a sense the D&I runs through the lifeblood of the firm, as opposed to being compartmentalized into different areas.
Interesting, thank you. And Tali, can you update us a bit on what's going on at Swiss Re? So what's the position, what's your position of where you're coming from and where you're headed to, and what are the steps you're taking? So Tali.
very similar to Vic. It starts at grassroots, because that's how it started, grassroots. And what we have found is that the investment, time and budget and commitment from the senior leadership is phenomenal. And that's when it started to really take a different steer and direction. So for us, we have a concept of leaders from every seat, and that means for every single one of us at Swiss Re, no matter where you are in the ecosystem, where you are around the globe, you are held accountable, you are responsible, you are part of the DEI journey. And it is absolutely a journey. I love it when you say we're still learning, we're still navigating and pivoting. For us, most of last year, particularly, was re-anchoring back on our why. So why is DEI important for us? So our purpose is to make the world more resilient. And in order to do so, DEI sits at heart and center of all of that. So it works quite a lot around the elevator pitch, because what I found was if you're able to explain to everyone, internally, externally, the why, then you start to connect with people much so on a human basis. And that's what really D&I is all about. It's a human connection. And that's been really phenomenal high impact. We've got certain principles as well. So ours really starts the umbrella around inclusive leadership. And that touches the concept of leaders from every seat. Our pillars around all of that are gender, LGBT+, race and ethnicity, and well-being. What we have also done, the grassroots has been really important for us, because it really feeds in the feeling and what is important for our colleagues around the organization. So we're now really introducing intersectionality across all of those themes. So the social mobility is an example, neuro-diversity is another example, and menopause is another big one that's come through. And we've got a whole stream around generations. So generations for us has been really important in the last few years, because when you look at the demographic of our organization, we recognize that we need to be agile in supporting all our generations from an intersectional lens. And some concrete examples of what we've been doing, from a generations perspective, we've held sessions around all aspects of financial well-being, all the way through talent management, LGBT+. We have, this I think for me is really a wonderful example of what can be achieved when working very closely with our ERGs. We've attained embassy status, which really means that we have implemented protective policies around the world and equalized our insured benefits for everyone, irrespective of your sexual orientation. And that's been really important for us as a global organization. And that's, for me, the equity and equalization. And mental health, that's, it started off in one country and then it just blossomed into all our other countries and regions. And what we also found from the race work that's taken place, we've introduced sponsorship in the last year, and we're now getting feedback on how that's working. And I think what I always learn from this area of work is the feedback from on the ground, from everyone where you can, because it's people's experiences and the impact it has on them, all these initiatives that we're doing. And finally, we really measure. So measuring what we're doing, what the progress we're making, and most of that measurement starts with the feedback.
That's really interesting, Tali. So you're creating that equity even where it doesn't exist within the market. So you step in if there's a disequity in insurance or something like that, and sort it out on behalf of the whole team.
Yeah, and I have to say credit to the I was going to say Together with Pride, our LGBT+ ERG, it really came from them. And this is where I think the power of ERGs working closely with the senior leadership, that connection is fundamental, because most of this thinking, the thoughts, the solutions comes from them, because it's their life experiences. It's there, and I talk a lot about the emotional human connection. When we sit down and listen and really connect with their experiences, we also then invite them to share solutions. And this is a piece of work that really needs a lot of investment to understand what is possible, and there's obviously a cost implication as well. But for me, it was amazing for Swiss Re to do this and say we're committed, we're going to lead on this.
Very interesting. So you've got all these different groups, and then you've got the structure above it, so that if they raise an issue, or when they do, they're encouraged to do so then the structure exists to actually be able to act upon it.
Yes, and we're continuing to learn. It's not perfect by any means. So we're still navigating and pivoting all the time. We're still learning. There are still areas that we need to improve on, and a lot of, and for now, this year is really about let's pause and re-anchor back on our strategy. What is our purpose? What do we want to achieve this year? It's all about outcomes. And I think one of the learning is less is more. So focus on one or two things that have high impact and do them well. And for me also, it's around, and I know we're going to touch on this, is the FCA conversation, the FCA discussion paper with the PRA and Bank of England. That for me is a really good anchor place in terms of the what next.
Well, I'm going to call Vic back in actually for a second now to give us that context. So can you remind us all, Vic, why this is such a big issue generally within financial services?
Yeah, I mean, D&I has exploded in recent years and on a number of fronts, and the FS sector is well aware of this. And the regulators, there's been lots of emphasis on financial misconduct over the years, but it's woken up to non-financial misconduct. And on the positive, it's woken up to the benefits of D&I. On the best side, you can see the business benefits that are brought along from having a diverse set of people. And actually, from a risk perspective, it's been very clear that we have to avoid groupthink mentality because it stops people seeing the business risks. Just to put that in context, we've got about 17% of FCA approved individuals are female. Fewer than 10% management roles in FS are held by minority ethnic backgrounds, and only 11% of investment management firms have a female CEO or chair. So we need to do more in our sector. Every sector needs to do more. So it's not just us, but it's becoming clear that an organisation's record on diversity and inclusion is fundamental to the public perception, and the FCA is not immune to this, and it wants to do much more.
You mentioned the FCA, so they're in the progress of consultation. So Olivia, can you give us an update on that consultation? Where's that going? What should we be doing? And how's that coming on?
Yeah, of course. So for all the reasons Vic's just said, we know D&I, it's a real top of the agenda cross-market priority for the FCA this year. And it's an absolutely critical component of everything they're doing around culture and governance. So the consultation, you'll remember, I know we touched on it at an earlier session, it was launched and the discussion paper published in July last year, and this was all around looking at ways of improving transparency essentially in respect to D&I. Just as it might be useful just to do a very quick reminder of the two key planks of consultation. So they were the obligation on listed companies to make annual disclosures relating to whether they meet board and exec management diversity targets, but just around gender and ethnicity, and very much on a comply or explain basis. And then the other key proposal was to amend corporate governance rules so that the existing reporting requirement on board diversity policies also applies to remuneration, audit and nominations committees, and potentially bringing in broader aspects of diversity like sexual orientation and disability. The original hope was that this would all be in place for now. It was probably overly optimistic. The outcomes from that consultation haven't yet been shared, but the idea is they are going to be used to develop more detailed proposals that are being consulted on in Q1, and the FCA are working towards issuing a policy statement, hopefully in Q3. But what we're seeing now, because of this coming down the track, many of our clients are really looking to get their house in order now so that they're ready for all of this change.
Okay, so Vix, what is the key focus areas of the FCA? So we know about the consultation, but what are their key focus areas in this, in driving D&I?
Yeah, so I call it the art. It's accountability, responsibility, transparency for firms and D&I, and we've talked about diversity of thought, and we've talked about how inclusion is important, and the FCA think that's really important from a speaking up perspective as well, so people feel safe to call out risks, so we don't get into a Lehman situation. the regulator recognises that it's important to be proportionate in its approach. So, I think the key point here is that if you're a small fintech firm, you're not expected to do the same stuff as if you're Barclays or Goldman Sachs. But what we're hearing loud and clear is that D&I is that it's important, it must infiltrate decisions, and there mustn't be, we need to stop this so-called group think because of hiring in the mirror. And very briefly, it's called out 5 or 6 things as being really important for future focus. So diverse representation of senior management, so that's really important for role modelling and influence. Board representation, so the FCA and the PRA are seeking feedback on whether there's a case for applying targets to a wider range of firms, and it should apply to just more than gender. We've heard a lot about gender, but obviously we know there's much more to diversity than just gender. Board succession planning, so is it going to be legitimate to so-called positively discriminate to ensure that there's a better balance on board? Individual accountability, so we've seen this a lot recently with the senior managers regime, but it links D&I right back into that individual accountability and for it being properly owned and accounted for, so it's not just somebody else's issue. Remuneration, cash is king in this world, the ultimate accountability. Proposals are afoot to see whether progress in this field could be linked to the variable remuneration, so the so-called turn up, turn down switch in this area. And also this kind of publication aspect we've seen from the gender pay gap, that publicising where you're at in this field calls firms to account. It makes people look at their reputational risk. It makes people look at their recruitment policies. So that's on the agenda as well. And then just generally much more transparency around disclosure of information and stats and data.
Well, actually, I'll bring Olivia in at this point. So what specific regulatory changes do you think, are being proposed, and do you think are going to get through from the FCA, Olivia?
Yeah, I think the changes that are being proposed are going to be absolutely critical in driving through meaningful change here. So just looking at those in a little bit more detail, fitness and propriety first. So the regulators are exploring now whether adverse findings in relation to an individual's behaviour when it comes to D&I issues could impact their assessment of that individual's fitness and propriety. So essentially the idea is they'd be bringing actions like sexual harassment, bullying, etc. under that definition of non-financial misconduct. Then senior management function approval. The FCA are considering whether they should be collecting diversity data about individuals as part of that information that's required for senior management function applications. And where they look at that, the applications and are concerned that a proposed appointment in the broader context could worsen the position in respect of D&I, they could actually look to scrutinise those applications further and then turn back and discuss those with the firms. And there could even be grounds for withholding approval. Threshold conditions, so they are considering developing guidance on how a firm's record on D&I may be taken into account when looking at whether a firm meets those threshold conditions, and that's both at authorisation stage and on an ongoing basis. And their thinking here is that this could be an added incentive for firms to address significant failings. And then finally, what they're really looking to do is to embed D&I practices and inclusion into supervisory practices. So going forward, we're likely to see supervisors ask much more detailed questions about how diversity is being embedded across the business. And the kind of questions that we anticipate they're going to ask that we can start thinking about now and preparing for are things such as linking back to a point Vic made at the start, the role of leadership, whether there's an environment where everyone can speak up and challenge, what actions firms are being taken to address any gaps, how are firms measuring success, how it's embedding D&I across all levels of the organisation, and how they're bringing D&I considerations and holding it into account as part of the firm's strategy.
Bring us into even further relief. Are there any recent cases or anything like that which we need to be aware of, Olivia, to kind of read and then quote? Should we need to be driving more attention in these areas? So, any recent cases?
Yeah, there's two I'd mention that are I'd call interesting ones. So the first one was from the end of 2020, and it was an age discrimination claim, but the principles kind of apply to all protected characteristics. And it was actually a US class action involving I think it was around 3,500 individuals against one of the big accountancy firms. The outcome I think would have been exactly the same if it was considered in the UK. But it concerned a claim brought by a 53-year-old accountant who, during his interview, he was asked, the people who work in these cubicles are much younger than you. How would you fit in? Would you feel okay working for a younger manager or director? That claim, it was a class action, settled for 8 million. The other angle to it as well is one of the allegations was the firm recruited almost exclusively through university recruiting. That was off limits to older workers, and also didn't post entry-level accountant jobs on their website. And I think the final nail in the coffin was when they found the average age of workers was around about 27. So it was kind of game over at that point. But that case has obvious learnings when it comes to firms' recruitment practices, and also the training we need to be giving to managers involved in recruitment decisions to avoid making those sorts of comments. So that was case one. The second one, which I think is really relevant now, is a more recent case which has looked at what's required in respect of D&I training when a firm is relying on the defence to a discrimination claim that all reasonable steps have been taken to prevent discrimination from happening, and training is an absolutely critical part of that. And we've seen employers often try and rely on fairly dusty policies and historic training when they're mounting this defence. And this case that came to the courts last year is useful in demonstrating that to hold any value and weight whatsoever as part of that reasonable steps argument, training cannot be stale. It needs to be reviewed and it needs to be recent. And in that case, training that was rolled out back in 2015 was too long ago. So the EAT made it clear that there has to be refresher training, and firms also, and really critically, and this is something which I think is often missed, need to be monitoring the effectiveness of any training courses. And then finally, just a couple of things to mention coming down the tracks for any members who have operations in the EU. By August, member states will have to have implemented the EU Work-Life Balance Directive, and that will include new baseline rights for carers and working parents. That's one thing to watch out for. And then two other things that we're eagerly still awaiting are the final position in respect of changes to flexible working rights. It's still out for consultation, but to be honest, we think at the moment it's probably looking likely to be lacking teeth and falling somewhat short of that promise to that they're looking to make flexible working the default. We're also awaiting the consultation response to the 2018, I can't believe it's now that long ago, government's consultation on mandatory ethnicity pay reporting. That said, we are seeing a lot of our clients voluntarily report and compile ethnicity pay reports.
Thank you. So we were going to look at kind of a few areas. We're going to look at race and ethnicity. We're going to look at neurodiversity, then age, and also social mobility. But I don't think we have time for all of those topics. So what I'm going to do is ask Tali first to talk a bit about what steps she's seeing and shed light on what we should be considering on race and ethnicity. So Tali, I'll call you in on that in a second. And then I think also it would be great to talk about age and what we should be thinking about there. So I'm picking two out of our list of four just for the matter of time. So Tali, can you tell us a bit about your thoughts on race and ethnicity and what we should be doing and what the position is?
Thank you. I'll keep it short because mindful of time. It's a lot of it's linked to what Olivia was sharing. I think such an amazing summary. Thank you. First of all, it's the learning, and the learning. I kind of use it at the umbrella of engagement because that can come in many forms. It can come through the official compliance learning. It can come through sessions like today. It can come from different forms, and I think listening to your colleagues, listen to life experiences and the impact. What I would say about the listening is listen with intent to make a difference. because what we have found through the back of BLM, there's lots of listening sessions. And then what are the outcomes? Because when we invite colleagues to share, there's an expectation, rightly so, for us as an organization then to do something with that information. That one of the outcomes could be a learning journey. So that's really important, and creating that safe space. We know about covering or code switching or masking, the impact on well-being. So this is where the intersectionality really comes to life. We know that the impact on people of color, race and ethnicity is phenomenal because of covering, code switching and masking. So what well-being initiatives do we have that we can support them with? The second one is around the data collection. We know, again, hearing Olivia and Vic talk about the FCA, transparency and accountability. We know ethnicity pay gap, the consultation started 4 years ago, paused because of COVID pandemic. It ultimately will come through. What are you doing to start to collating the data? So in my previous role 4 years ago, I disclosed ethnicity pay gap way back then. Here at Swiss Re, we're now looking at how we collate the data. We've got a whole project team around it. So I say start to put together a project team to collate the data, to see what it's telling you. It is complex. No one for 1 minute saying it's not complex, but that shouldn't stop us. And I think take your time. So put in a really robust working group where representation from the organization, legal, the IT team, HR, ERGs, councils, so forth. This is one where really robust conversations to happen. And I think finally is around keeping momentum, and it's small steps. When we look at some of 2020, so much was going on. I'm starting to see conversations change. It'd be great now if we can move conversations to action and impact. So for me, 3 things: learning, conversations, and data.
Thank you, Tali. That's really good. And what about age? Could you kick us off with Olivia on thoughts about age? What should we be doing there and thinking about?
Yeah, I think age is a really interesting one, and I think the issue with age is, to date, it's really been kind of the poor relation of the protected characteristics, with a lot of anti-discrimination efforts being focused more around gender and racial equality issues. But within financial services, it's a really live issue now because we're seeing 2 trends. So on the one side, we've got this really pervasive talent gap. And then on the other side, we've got a rise in the number of, I hate to use the phrase, but baby boomers who are still employed or are seeking new employment. But what we're seeing happen is, in trying to fill that talent gap, many institutions are instead focusing on recruiting what we call digital natives, so millennials and Generation Zs who've grown up with the internet, the latest iPhone, rather than tapping into the talent of older hires. And I think it's a scary thought, but apparently age is perceived to be a disadvantage when looking at the capability of workers who are over 55. That's not to say it isn't being addressed at the moment, and there are some really good examples of firms who are leading the way on this front. So, for example, Barclays, 17%, around 70% of their UK workforce is between 50 to 69, and they're looking to increase it by 12% this year. And they're focusing on initiatives like using foundational advanced apprenticeships to attract older workers who are maybe looking to return to work or change their careers. Aviva, I know they use real life scenario based training on age bias for its board and its line managers. And we've seen many other initiatives, including 2-way mentoring programs, where there's this buddying up system between these baby boomers and millennials and Generation Z, so that they can learn from each other. But I think it's fair to say this is probably the diversity strand, which does require a lot more focus and proactive effort going forwards.
Great. So with that, I'd like to wrap up with some takeaways. So I'm going to turn to each of our speakers, each of you guys, to highlight one strategic and one practical way in which we should be moving forward. So I start with you, Vic.
Yeah. So my sort of, it won't be news, but I guess my strategic takeaway is this needs to be owned from the top, and whether you've got a one-man band CEO or you've got a C-suite, it has to come from there, or else it won't get taken seriously. And the practical takeaway from that is, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's just worth, every time you're making a decision at CEO level, just checking it from a D&I lens. And it might take you backwards on the journey, and it might take you forwards. And actually, it's just a cognizant noticing, what is this doing to us?
And that is your one strategic. Is there a practical way we should be focusing on that as well?
So I think the practical way on that is just to have somebody sitting alongside the CEO and just minuting that, and then taking it to HR, so that they just are checking that the D&I runs, the decision has been made from a D&I lens.
Brilliant.
So it's just to check it.
Okay, Olivia, what are your thoughts? What are your 2 takeaways?
Well, anyone who knows me knows I love data, so I'm going to focus on the importance of data as my strategic takeaway, because, you know, at the end of the day, diversity targets are absolutely meaningless without proper data sitting behind them. So we need to have proper measures in place to ensure that we have meaningful data capture, so that as a very starting point, when we're looking at strategy, we can understand our demographics. And I think there have been, well, we know there have been issues here with firms finding it tricky to gather data, even on the basic level when you're looking at gender and ethnicity, because a lot of that data capture happens on a voluntary basis, and there's often low take up. And then we see that firms are even less well developed when they're trying to capture data related to sexual orientation, disability, and the other protected characteristics. So I think there needs to be more focus on that, and the first plank of any strategy has to be around that effective data collection piece.
I have to say, Olivia, that you're absolutely right. People are scared of data collection, scared of what they can do and what they can't do in this area. And I'm not sure how progressed that thought is.
Yeah, and I think it is challenging, Tom, as well, particularly when you're trying to do that on an international basis because of the differences in local laws, and particularly from a data protection perspective. So it does involve sort of working through what you can or can't do when you're trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all strategy when operating internationally.
And I do think that fear and that lack of proper guidance about data collection and data retention in this area is problematic, actually.
Yeah, no, I agree. So that was my strategic point. On the practical side, I'd go for a takeaway around recruitment, because traditional recruitment in financial services, I think it very much has been sort of fishing in this pool that is predominantly male. And at the end of the day, if you shake an apple tree, oranges ain't going to fall out. So we, on a practical level, do need to be, and it's the same for us in law firms as well, really thinking about where we recruit from. And we often find recruiters will pull together shortlists from people working in similar roles at other firms, and sometimes CVs with career gaps get screened out. So it's putting up these artificial barriers. So we really need a different approach to this, and we actually need to be saying to our recruiters, look, we want you to go out and look for somebody with a career gap, and also challenge recruiters about whether have we in place diversity-centric recruitment so that we're improving access for all. That's my practical takeaway, Tom, but actually my favourite is Tali's reference earlier on to listening with intent to make a difference.
Right, okay, yes, and I'm going to call Tali in a second. She may repeat that, let's see. But I'm loving that. I've written down my 3 to-do lists, which are listening with intent, thinking about the data I've got within my business and trying to understand that better, and then also thinking about my recruitment practices again and rethinking them, because I think you're absolutely right. I think I recently, 6 months or a year ago, but thinking about them again is on my New Year's list. So, Tali, what would you add to that from a strategic and practical point of view? What are your takeaways?
Let's start with practical mentoring. I love mentoring. I think it's incredibly powerful, but I would say looking at it from a strategic perspective. So when you are starting to think about a mentor for yourself, or you're putting together a mentoring and you're inviting people to participate, the mentee really needs to spend time to critically assess what's the gap. What gap are they looking to fill? And then finding that mentor who can fill the gap. Is it influencing? Is it sales? Is it strategic involvement? Is it networking? Is it technical? Find really critical analysis of what gap. And that starts to make a difference, because if we just randomly find a mentor and we don't really focus on what outcome we're trying to achieve, it always comes back to the outcome and intent. So that's the practical. And I think always having a business mentor is really impactful, because you really start to connect with the business. You start to connect with what is happening in the business and how it impacts different parts of the ecosystem, as I keep describing it. The second, the strategic one, there are so many. We've touched on the data piece, but I'd say the listening, the conversations, keeping the conversations. And I know some people will say, well, that's not strategic. It's strategic if you actually say, I'm going to talk to one person who is different from me every day, one person.
Right. Got it. So you're talking about
different part of the business, different part of the organization, different part globally. This is about different perspectives and starting to learn from each other, but also feeling uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's really important.
So, because listening in itself sounds very airy-fairy. You've turned that into a practical way of putting it into our daily work, and actually it's valid, right? It's statistically valid. It makes a difference. It's just that we're so used to doing things which are, you know, a more directed manner. But if we have one conversation every week or even every day with somebody who we wouldn't normally speak to, you actually think implicitly that brings a huge difference.
Yes, and we can link it to the data collection. You know, one of the reasons, putting aside all the legal elements of it, when we go out and do a campaign to invite colleagues to share their data, it's your self-identity, it's sensitive, it's personal, putting aside all the legal GDPR issues around that. You need to feel comfortable, you need that psychological safety. And the listening, starting to build connections in the organizations with people who you may not have built connections with, start to bridge that gap. The second piece is being very clear on our why. Why are we doing all of this? That elevator pitch, that creates these psychological safety as well. So all of these little puzzles, or the jigsaw puzzles, when you bring them together, help us collate the data, help us with the disclosure rate, help us identify where gaps of the employee life cycle there might be that we need to start mitigating barriers. So these are just really small steps, but high impact cumulatively.
You've really helped me on the data points. When I get scared of data, I think about data as being a great big list, but you're describing data about being sample data, individual conversation data, and that being equally valid. And it reminds me that, of course, that's true, but it is, you know, whenever anyone talks about data in this area, I always think about lists, and that's not what's necessary.
And I would just add, Tom, I would just add that there's always, behind that list, there's always a person. There's always a human being. And I think that's why the listening, the conversations, the why are we doing this? Why is this important for our business? It's so important because for every report we get from the data collection, that's a human being. Brilliant,
brilliant. Well, look, I'd like to thank everybody for that. I'm going to think about my lists and my listening going forward, and I hope that was useful to all of our panelists, to all of our listeners. So thank you very much, Tali. Thank you, Olivia.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
And thanks, Vix.
Thank you for having me.
And just finally, we have a question that's come through on the chat, on the Q&A, and perhaps, I don't know if anyone wants to come forward, but what neurodiverse profile is most common in the workplace in your experience, and how will corporates square the needs to be efficient or generate profit whilst adjusting to support these ND individuals? I don't know who wants to take on that.
I was going to do a little bit on neurodiversity, so I'm very happy just to take that in the couple of minutes that's left. Is that work for you, Tom? So a couple of things on neurodiversity. 1 in 10 of us are neurodiverse. So that's ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia. And what we've seen from that is actually we need to have inclusive work practices, because actually some of the bigger employers, so JP Morgan Chase, EY, Goldman's, have all discovered that people who are neurodiverse actually have brilliant creative thinking abilities, lateral thinking abilities, extremely good at data. So there's been a lot of attention in the past on the fact that this might be a disability. Well, it probably would be a disability, but actually there's huge business benefits in neurodiversity. The world's woken up to it, and there are now specific programs to encourage, not just live with, but encourage neurodiverse people into the workplace.
Thank you, Vic, and hopefully it was submitted by somebody anonymous, so I can't direct the question, but hopefully that answers their question. So thank you very much to all of our panelists this morning. Great session to kick off 2022. And thank you all for attending and taking the time out of your morning to come along. The next session, as I mentioned, is in March, and invites will be sent out soon. We are aiming to do a hybrid event, so in person, as well as joining on Zoom as well. I believe the Osborne Clarke team are hosting a festival of sessions for financial services, and James has shared the link in the chat, and we'll also share on our follow-up email. So do head over to James's link to check out what they've got going on. And I believe there are some topics on diversity and inclusion, so specifically for financial services to get involved. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody. Fingers crossed for the government rule regulations lifts next week. And we look forward to seeing you all again in March. Thank you.